Tennessee Valley and beyond on frequency modulation 92.7. Sean Hannity, 25,000 watts on digital FM 95.3 HD4. CBS Radio News. NASCAR, Bloomberg Markets, David Tulis, streaming strong at Noogaradio.com. Live on YouTube and Facebook. Nooga Radio, News Talk 92.7. Chattanooga Radio.
Good morning, Chattanooga. This is Jim McCoon and Clay Whitaker. We're here with Legal Bytes. It's a weekly edition of our show to discuss with each of you in your homes and in your cars what's going on in the legal world as it may apply to your personal lives, your businesses, and your families. Really with a heavy heart this week, Clay, because of what happened this past Sunday in Texas. It's just been a terrible situation with respect to the shooting in that church. And I guess as lawyers, we look at it differently than a lot of other people do, because we look at it from the standpoint of where is the exposure and what could have happened and what could have been done and what should have been done to try to protect those people, if anything.
That's right, Jim. You know, I don't think a lot of people realize how attorneys end up analyzing these situations, and it's not that we're heartless and don't think about the human toll that was taken, but you know, since this is our profession, it is our practice, and we come across these things, it's just natural that we would analyze it and give people the information they're going to need. Particularly, you know, we're talking about premises liability today. It's not strictly limited to the churches, but unfortunately, that's one of the topics I think we're going to need to delve into a little bit. So pastors, deacons, ushers, and church members should pay attention. If you're out there listening, we'd love to have you give us a call. It's 800-8949. Give us a call. We'll talk about any legal topic. That's a new format we've adopted.
Right. That's true. We've got an open forum. If you've got an issue that's on your heart or on your mind that you really need to talk to someone about legally, give us a call, and we're happy to take it on no matter what the topic is of the day. But here, I think based upon what came out of San Antonio in that area, it just drove Clay and I to consider what's going on, because I know when you and I grew up, church was where you went and you saw your friends and you saw your neighbors' parents sitting up there with your parents, and it was a very safe place.
Well, it was. You know, we talked a little bit about that on the way to handle this radio show, and that been a big shift in the country. It's a shift in terms of the demographics. It's a shift in terms of the quality of the people. I always look at things, and I think lawyers like to think of things in terms of probabilities and the large demographics that we look at. And if you thought about this in our country in the way of a big bell curve, if you're familiar with that old concept, you know, there's the fringes are always, you know, stuff that you have to look at. The people who don't have that great citizenship quality, like we used to preach and talk about, are becoming more apparent. It's very unfortunate.
Now, you took some time and looked in to see historically and in other countries, because I know America is different, with Christianity being one of the founding faiths of the forefathers. But you looked in other countries and other areas of the world historically to see what churches have done or continue to do even this day in some countries with respect to trying to protect its parishioners or its members and congregation.
That's true, Jim. You know, if you look, the church being around at least 2,000 years, is debatable about the connection in the church before that it has always pre-existed the founding of the church by Christ. But because Jesus Christ came and was incarnate in the flesh, the body of Christ has become apparent, become visible. And as part of that, there were church offices, still are church offices that are filled by people. And that those offices, one of them included, obviously, besides the priest or pastor, you had the diaconate, which you had deacons, and then you have those persons who might serve other functions like taking care of the interior of the church. And in traditional churches like the Orthodox Catholic Church, you might find a gatekeeper. Gatekeeper actually had a function at one point in time where they stood at the outside of the gate. And, you know, people have the idea that Christian worship is always open. At one point in time, it was not. And because of the mysteries of the church, they were secret. And keeping those secret mysteries only for those people who were members of the church and in communion, meaning that they were fit and able, had been baptized and were able to take communion. Those gatekeepers prevented people from being inside the church who were not actually participating in the most sacred rite of Christian tradition, that is the Eucharist.
Right. And so basically you had a gatekeeper, and then ushers had a function of maintaining control inside the church.
Sure. And I think that's been, if you looked at a Western European church history, you'd find where there was at some point the schism occurred in the 11th century, and then the Reformation. The church functions have changed some, but nonetheless, there were always groups of people, and primarily men, would have to say that were in charge of maintaining church order. And so even when you're looking at that particular type of office, we have that today in most of American churches. That is, we would have ushers, we would have deacons, we might have greeters. We have people who are sort of standing out in front of the church and may be considered to have some sort of role in regards to a security function.
Right. I agree. So we go from not only the secretism of the church and maintaining its mystics effectively to the outside world, but also because of persecutions, the church had to be secretive, sometimes not even letting others know where they were meeting, and for fear Romans or others would persecute them. So you had some type of security and protection that was being given by the church itself. And then, of course, as the church developed, the church began to provide a place of immunity, basically, for people who the outside world might want to persecute. You could go to the church, and I've even seen that in movies, where you go into the church, and the church is a protected place where the officials could not come in and arrest or take up in the light. So the church had a protective function. In the United States, that has changed. We've never, at least in more recent times, ever considered the church a situation where it was going to be providing security, or I don't think there was an expectation of the community that the church was providing security or protection, because the community itself were members, and they saw the church as a welcomed entity in the neighborhood or in the area.
I think that's right, Jim. And I think, if you'd note, times have changed. We're underway a great persecution around the world. Christianity is the most persecuted group that you can identify, religious or ethnic. It doesn't matter. You look at it, the numbers are overwhelming. Our country, unfortunately, has been involved in a way that I think certainly is not the topic for this show, but it's in a way that if we've been very fortunate, we have not had persecution in this country. We don't see it. And so haven't paid as much attention to what's going on around the world. If you look out of the Middle East, that function of gatekeeper, or that function of someone involved in security, it has certainly been something that people around the world, particularly if you're looking in the Middle East, have had to employ because of the danger associated with groups that want to persecute the Christians.
Right. So, you go from there, the Christians are in the minority and are the subject of discrimination, to where we're in our country now, and the minority seems to be attacking the church, such as the things that happened in San Antonio. And so what responsibility does a church and its officers and its board of deacons or its board of elders, what responsibility does the church have in today's America to consider protection, security, and the like with respect to its congregation?
Well, you and I have talked about this a lot, and not just with churches, but we're going to include that as part of this discussion. Premises liability really has the foundation and the concept of foreseeability. So we got a caller here, Jim.
Yeah, let me see if I can get that caller on the line. Hold on a second. Hello, caller. This is Legal Bytes. You're on the air. How can we help you?
Great topic. I'm going to throw a little monkey wrench in. Christians and unborn babies are two of the most persecuted and prosecuted groups and individuals in America today. However, the killing in Texas wasn't the largest mass murder in Texas. It was David Koresh in Waco, Texas, was the largest mass murder. And I'm amazed how people weren't outraged. They're outraged now, which I am too as a Christian. But how aren't we outraged that another religion that I don't really know that much about other than they were peaceful, that the federal government went in and murdered 76 innocent men, women, and children, burned them out. The FBI and the rest of them shot them, killed them, burned them, like they did with MOVE in Philadelphia. So there's a tyranny going on in our republic. Look at the Bundys, shot dead with his hand up. Look at the federal jury releasing them, and Ruby Ridge, on and on and on. We have more tyranny from the federal government than individuals, and I think we need to look at that. That the feds persecute and prosecute all religions, especially now Christians.
Well, no,
I'd like to have your take on that. Thanks.
All right, thank you, and I'll hook you up with that. Caller raises an interesting issue, but from that standpoint, he says our government persecutes individuals. Our government contains individuals, and it's not the government based upon its principles that is doing this. I think our principles are freedom of speech, freedom of religion, that all people are equal. Our principles are there. The problem is we have individuals. Sometimes it's officers. I mean, it's not just the federal government, it's state government, it's county officials, it's city officers, county officers. There are always people who either intentionally or unintentionally take action that causes harm that may violate rights. That's an individual issue, caller. And from, at least from my take, our principles are there. It's just that because of the nature of what's happening in society, we have individuals who are walking over those principles, walking on rights and taking action, either like the man in San Antonio, because of possible mental issues, because of possible family issues and the like, and anger issues. He did that. Or it's because of power issues where maybe a local officer or a state actor feels power and just abuses that power and causes problems. We see that in jails with prisoners not getting medical treatment when they should be. Sometimes that's an economic issue where the jailers just don't want to incur the expense for the criminal. But regardless, and Clay, let me know if you think I'm wrong, but I don't think it's our government. I think it's individuals using the mantle of the government to carry out their own agendas.
I'll just say this, Jim. I'll sort of take up what the caller was saying is, our country was founded on the principle that government must be restrained. You looked and listened to what Patrick Henry said, and Thomas Paine talked about those two writers and those two men who were part of our revolutionary ethos back in the beginning of this country, always sort of looked at the government in a suspicious manner, and that the framers were very cautious about power associated with the government being a public government, ours not being a private one. That is not having the ties to monarchy or the power being associated with private families or private groups. It's a public group, and of course, when you have a country as powerful as ours is, you have to make sure that you have restraint on the ability of the government. That's what our Constitution does. Unfortunately, I think we've lost our focus a little bit on what the Constitution's purpose is and on the restraint of the government, that is the federal government, at the expense of state governments. So, the caller's right in one sense that you have to always be on guard against tyranny, the government, by its centralization of power and the extreme power that we have in our law enforcement. You've got to be cautious about that, but never forget that our Constitution always recognized and was suspicious of governmental power.
Right. But again, governments don't act, people act. It's like a corporation. A corporation can only act to its representatives, the government as well. And it's where the individuals are out of line or excessive in their use of power or abusive in what they're doing. It's where the problem is. And that's where we as attorneys have to step forward and take acts to protect the individuals, to protect corporations from overtaxing or whatever, and do the right things to make sure that the laws and the Constitution are abided by.
I agree with you, Jim.
So thank you very
Thank
much
you
for that call. That was a good call.
But we were talking about premises liability and the concept of foreseeability. So in regards to foreseeability, you know, most folks don't look at the things the way that attorneys do, but you may have heard the terms risk assessment, or you may have some people who are involved in risk management or be familiar with that sort of profession. And the idea simply is to look out and to determine the place where you are, the things that happen around you. Are there risks associated with that particular place or the things that you're doing that have to be protected against?
Businesses do that every day. OSHA compliance, trying to do things to make sure your employees are in a safe workplace. If you're dealing with hazardous waste, then you got to make sure you're compliant with the RECA regulations, make sure your satellite container areas are properly maintained, that all of your berms and all of your tertiary containment areas are in place. All those kind of things, all of those are done as an ordinary course of basically self-auditing to make sure are contained and approached. And then on top of that, after you've figured out what the footprint of your risk is, then you get insurance or take steps to make sure that you've covered that risk as best you can. So businesses do that. But churches aren't used to doing that type of thing.
They aren't. I mean, what you see churches doing, and I think most churches of any size have some insurance. And so they do recognize there may be some things on their property that have to be protected against. Ordinary things like slipping and falling, fires, things associated with damage to vehicles and parking lots, those sorts of things. But you don't ordinarily consider active shooters, or at least we haven't until here in this last several years. I think that's become a real concern for people.
It's not just churches, it's movie theaters, it's rock and roll concerts. Look at the world. It's any type of a congregation of people now. The show in Las Vegas, the country western show in it just doesn't matter. Anytime you have a congregation, there's a risk of something happening by someone who's not of right mind.
And I would agree with you, Jim. And so, it's going to take a little bit of change in the way that we do things. And so when you have those congregation of people, having a timely assessment of risk associated are going to take sort of precedence in the way that you handle that event. That includes involving law enforcement and having whatever notification they may have, any intelligence that those law enforcement agencies may have. Certainly some things like the one that happened this last time in Southern Springs. I think that's the full name of the town outside of San Antonio. I think no one had any notice that this young man was going to do that. Unfortunately, for the kind of notification we're talking about, it requires people to be observant, to make assessments of the people that are around them, and then to talk about that with law enforcement. They just sort of tell on them. I think there's some aversion to that in this United States, that we don't like telling on our neighbors, even though that those things may be required to gather up-to-date and legitimate intelligence to be able to make assessments of risk associated with large gatherings, including your Sunday meeting for worship.
Well, there's a change going on, though, because how many communities now have neighborhood watch signs up? There is a realization, I think, in America, with the size of the population and the growth and the aversion to paying local taxes to provide additional law enforcement officers. I think there's an understanding that people have to undertake this somewhat on their own and be a good neighbor and take steps to watch out for other guys' back doors and those kind of things. So I think there's been a movement in the past probably 15, 20 years where I think society in America is understanding that we can't be safe relying on others. We've got to participate in those decisions. But I think you're right. Since 9/11 and since the terrorist activities and the heightened use of terroristic acts, basically to cause attention, even if they weren't a terrorist, to cause attention to that person or to bring about some result they want, I think we now are realizing we've got to do more.
Well, I think so, Jim. We were just talking the other day about there's a fire alarm that went off at the courthouse. And one of the first things, I was there at the courthouse, first thing that came to my mind is, somebody's going to go downstairs. We're all going to get out on the front of the courthouse. And unfortunately, someone's going to do some criminal activity either shooting people outside the courthouse, some of those sorts of things. And, you know, we're not
just trying to rid Chattanooga of too many lawyers.
They're reading too much Shakespeare. We're going to say that. Well, and so, you know, we're talking about, this premises liability. Anyone who wants to call us about any legal topic, it's 800-8949, but we're focusing on, risk assessment, risk management, premises liability, and how it relates to churches is one of the areas we'd like to talk about a little bit.
And the other thing is, now that this has happened, can any church say that it's not on notice that this is a foreseeable type of event?
I don't think so, Jim. I think that we're at the point now where that's certainly something you have to consider, and you have to make an assessment of the area where you meet at. And that includes a number of things. That includes a number of things related to how your church service is organized. And it probably includes an analysis of your religious tenets. You know, one of the things about Christianity is that we certainly believe, and we shouldn't limit this only to churches. It could happen at synagogues or mosques as well. But, you know, bottom line is that in Christianity, the tenet would be that the Lord said we were going to endure sufferings, and that it should bring you great joy when that happens. Now, that is a strange thing to say at the time we've just witnessed this horrific crime. But, you know, many people in these churches are going to come to this conclusion that our church doesn't really promote the idea that churches should have armed security guards, even though you want to avoid tragedy. You want to, as one other tenet might say, lay down your life for your fellow man. But in that case, are we talking about all the members of the church being armed, or just a few of them? Or are we talking about employing strategies like locking the doors where people can't freely walk in? Are we talking about having metal detectors and video cameras and things that would ordinarily be employed at other events or locations, such as government locations where you have to be scanned before you can come into your church?
Sure. And when we talk about responsibility for premises liability as the owner or operator of a facility, you talk about notice and knowledge of the person managing that property. And so, you know, we talked about, has what happened in Texas put churches on notice that they've got a heightened duty? But it goes simpler than that. Have you had break-ins in your parking lot at Wednesday night meetings while everyone's eating supper and going to the prayer meeting? Have purses been taken out of cars? Have windows been broken? Is there some vandalism occurring? That simple type of event puts you on notice that there's a potential risk in your parking lot. And so at that point in time, do you need to take steps to put lighting out in the parking lot, to put out cameras in the parking lot, things to secure the facility for the benefit of the people that are attending? I mean, malls go through this every day. Every day, people going to Hamilton Place or to Northgate or to a mall in Atlanta, you know, you've got things, injuries occur in the mall, outside the mall, and those individuals expect there to be appropriate security.
Well, Jim, you're right. And so we're coming up on the close of this half hour, and we barely even scratched the surface of this topic, it being one that is timely and one that, as you say, touches many areas of our society. It's not just churches, it's businesses, it's the government, governmental functions. It's all it could be the Lions Club or the Rotary Club also. So it's one of those things that we have to continue to take a look at. And we certainly welcome your calls. It's 800-8949. This is Legal Bytes on Nooga Radio. Please give us a call. We'd love to talk to you about this topic or anything else you'd like to discuss.
I agree, Clay. It is a very interesting topic, and I think that it applies to so many properties and so many opportunities for people to meet. So we'll talk to you on the other half hour.
The Tennessee Valley's news talk leader, Nooga Radio, digital FM 95.3 HD4 and 92.7 FM. 3, 2, 1. Chattanooga Radio, digital FM 95.3 HD4, 92.7 FM's news now.
Crossed lines in Chattanooga and beyond, causing serious problems for 911 dispatchers, especially apparently for AT&T customers. 911 calls were going to the wrong call center all throughout Tennessee. This affected Hamilton County, Bradley County, Sequatchie County, and beyond. The director of 911 call centers in Hamilton County says the problem has been solved. The cause has not been released to the public. A major drug bust in Chattanooga that started out as a fire at a hotel. Firefighters extinguished the fire and discovered over 20 pounds of marijuana inside that hotel room. It appeared to be what they call a dab lab, where butane is used to extract THC oil from marijuana buds. Butane being lighter fluid, you can imagine how the fire may have started. An arrest has not been made. Russell Stroud, Nooga Radio News Talk 92.7. Now.
Traffic, news, and information. Nooga Radio. Digital FM 95.3 HD4 and 92.7 FM.
Sam Jordan, News Talk 92.7 Sports Now. Cade Mays, offensive lineman prospect from Knoxville, officially decommitted from the Tennessee Vols recruiting list for 2018. The 6'6", 318-pound five-star recruit out of Knox Catholic High School made his decision personally on his Twitter account. He attributed it to Coach Butch Jones's instability as the head coach at Tennessee, and with the team having a 4-5 record so far, attributing to that decision. The Vols class of 2018 is the 13th best in the country. He's visited Clemson 2 weeks ago and also at Georgia, and is scheduled to visit Ohio State this weekend. Cleveland State cross-country team will be sending their top 2 runners to the National Junior College Athletic Association Championships in Fort Dodge, Iowa on Saturday. It's the first postseason meet for the inaugural program. Madison Guider will be running a 1-loop 8K course, and Luis Perez running a 2-loop 8K course as well. Sam Jordan, News Talk 92.7 Sports Now.
Expect cloudy and cool weather out there through your afternoon. Highs only to the upper 50s. Tonight, areas of light rain will push back in from the south and west. Lows mid and upper 40s. For Thursday, clouds will slowly decrease. Drier highs into the lower 60s with more sunshine Friday. Through Saturday only at JCPenney. Get an additional 50% off clearance prices already reduced by 50 to 70%. Plus get $10 off with coupon when spending $25 or more only at JCPenney. And I'm Soar Machine 12 Chief Meteorologist Patrick Ford.
The Tennessee Valley's news talk leader. Nooga Radio. Digital FM 95.3 HD4 and 92.7 FM.
An automated nuclear missile defense system has suddenly entered into launch mode, and you are the only one who can stop it. Escape Experience Chattanooga. Your team has just been infected with a deadly virus. Your only hope? There, in an abandoned farmhouse. Escape Experience Chattanooga. Handcuffed in a maximum security prison, you have an hour to flee. Escape Experience Chattanooga. These escape scenarios and more at Chattanooga's best escape room game and team building platform. Call now. Slots are limited. Register online at escapeexperience.com/Chattanooga. Escape Experience Chattanooga.
Hey, Mom.
Yes, Summer.
I know what I'd like to do for Christmas this year.
What would you like to do?
Take shoeboxes full of goodies to the homeless military veterans.
What would go into these shoeboxes?
Toothbrushes, toothpaste, dental floss, deodorant, chapsticks, shampoo, soap, hand warmers, hand sanitizer, socks, gloves, toboggans, small Bibles, blankets, snacks, and cough drops.
Where can people donate these items?
Alpine Crest Elementary School, Sonic on Hickson Pike next to Frontrunner, Chick-fil-A in Northgate Mall in Hickson, and Nooga Radio below Goss Insurance across from Bojangles on Hickson Pike.
When will we distribute the shoeboxes?
On November 10th from 11 to 12:30 and December 15th from 10:30 to 12:30 at the Community Kitchen on East 11th Street, downtown Chattanooga. Please help us in donating these items for our shoebox campaign. No veteran should ever go homeless.
Nooga Radio. Digital FM 95.3 HD4 and 92.7 FM knows your opinion is important. So call 800-8949. Agree or disagree? Call 423-800-8949. 800-8949. Nooga Radio. 92.7 FM and 95.3 HD4. News Talk Nooga Radio.
People got to kill.
Welcome back to the second half hour of Legal Bytes. Jim McCoon, Clay Whitaker. Appreciate you for joining us in our show. Hopefully you were able to listen to some of the first half hour. We're talking today about basically the aftermath and the fallout that comes from what occurred in San Antonio or the suburb of San Antonio, where the shooting occurred at a church, and what impact that has on churches, other congregations, mosques, synagogues, the like, and on general, basically group gatherings. Do you have a responsibility, and is there premises liability that can adhere? And what kind of notice, because we talked back that a manager or owner or operator of a facility has an obligation to provide a safe and secure environment. This based largely on, did you have notice of a dangerous condition? And so our church is now on notice because of what happened in Texas. Are they on notice because of things that are happening either in the community around their church or on their property, such as in the parking lots, or handbags being stolen from cars during meetings, or people being accosted coming into the church, maybe just by a panhandler, someone asking for money, but any type of approach into your personal space that occurs, even if it doesn't result in an assault or battery. Does that put the church on notice of a duty? And how do they carry out their obligations if they have that duty? Those are all issues that are now really hot, I think, for churches and their boards and their pastors and everyone else.
I think so, Jim. And so any of you listeners that have that question, that are members of churches or would like to have your church discussing those issues with attorneys, we'd be pleased to do that. We'd come to meet with you. You can come to our office. We could come to you. The number is 756-6400. That's the law office of McCoon, Williams, Ashley, and Stanley. This is a timely topic, and it is something that has become more prevalent. But if you'll recall, there were still other incidences that have happened in years past, including, people who have been shot. The shooting that occurred in South Carolina with the Dylan Roof case. That was one. This case, of course. And there have been others that have
the civil rights movement with the young girls killed in Birmingham with the bombing.
Yeah, 1963.
I mean, this is not new. It's just horrific right now, and it's all in our minds and our eyes. But this is something that continually has occurred with congregations, and it's not just churches. I mean, synagogues have had issues. Mosque. I mean, there's been so much vitriol and litigation over mosques, part because of what's going on with the terror in the Middle East, but also part just because of pure discrimination in this country, that, they've had issues. So these are not new topics, but people need to realize that they need to address the risk and the issues that come out of these topics.
I think that's right, Jim. So, you talked about whether or not this is sufficient notice for the nation simply because it happened in Texas. Let's not forget, not more than 2 months ago, we had the same thing occur in Antioch, Tennessee, where a young man came in and shot members of the church. So I don't believe Tennessee churches can say they did not have notice of this circumstance. And so
get closer than that. Ringo, several years ago, we had high school boys break into churches and put demonic drawings all over the walls and things like that. So churches have been the targets of criminal activity.
Well, and so, criminals usually have take at least the targets of opportunity. And many times churches are not protected. They don't have sufficient security set up. They've not made a risk assessment. And, most of the time they're not occupied. We don't have services every day. So they certainly lend themselves to being places that are vacant, and that might be subject to people, at least, as we say, having some sort of scoping them out or laying some sort of surveillance down to make sure that the criminals can take advantage of the churches when they are occupied.
Right. And then when they're not occupied, you normally have a church secretary, maybe working, maybe just a receptionist for the church. And that young or older woman being alone in that facility may cause even higher risk to protect her when she's on the job working as an employer. You've got responsibility here. So your duties aren't just premises liability to the invitees that come onto your premises. Your duties are also to the staff and the people that work there and the things that can occur. And so the scope of your concerns, if you're an operator or an owner of a facility such as a house of worship can be very great.
It can, Jim. You know, we had talked before we came today about the issue of volunteering to take up a duty. So, you know, besides the issue of foreseeability, you come into the analysis of whether or not there are risks associated with churches, looking at what duty a church may have to provide security. Of course, foreseeability is part of that analysis. But the other option is that churches look at this situation and say, well, you know, we believe that we should have some sort of security force because of these issues that we've seen, the frequency that they appear to be occurring at, and whether that's real or whether it's manufactured by television. Either way, we've decided we're going to do it. If you volunteer to take up a security duty, then you have to do a good job at it. And
right.
That means
even though the law would not place it on you.
That's correct. And that means you got to take a look at the whole program. You can't do a halfway job. So that might include anywhere from employing technology such as metal detectors. And I know that people would really be horrified to go to your church and have to go through a metal detector. But, you know, that is becoming very commonplace these days, and that doing that might be necessary along with video surveillance and maybe having even some sort of identification saying you belong to that church.
Agreed. I mean, I know that I spoke with a gentleman probably a year or so ago where they were having break-ins in their church parking lot, people's purses, just items, you know, could be, you know, items that were left on the back seat like were being taken while services were ongoing, especially the night service when the parking lot was darker. And he was a retired investigator and was considering setting up a security firm effectively within the church to undertake steps to make sure things were protected and people's property was protected. And, you know, the one thing I advised him was, please don't do that within the church. If you're going to set up a security firm, set it up as a separate entity, engage in a contract with the church, get that your security entity bonded and insured. And then even if that's your only customer is that church, you know, and you're doing it as a service and not really charging a fee, continue to do it that way. So at least you separate the liability for inadequate security or failing to do the right thing, or at least the risk of litigation if something happens, take it away from the church and put it more on the guys who are taking the responsibility. And again, as you said, in Tennessee, as in most states, even if you don't have a duty, if you volunteer to undertake that duty, you're held to a reasonable man standard and you can't do it negligently.
Well, you know, Jim, that's a good point. You know, in Tennessee, independent contractors don't necessarily pose, at least initially under the analysis, wouldn't pose a risk of liability for the person that contracts them for damages to other persons on the property of the property owner. So let's say that you'd hired someone to come on the church property and act as a security person. You know, you're not necessarily going to become liable for their actions unless there's some other factors associated with the way that they conduct that business.
Either that or you were negligent in choosing that firm. You chose an inept firm to provide the security and because you wanted to pay below market or whatever to provide the service.
So, you know, in terms of the law, just so that people are aware, you're going to incur liability as a result of notice, foreseeability of criminal activity and failing to do something about it, or voluntarily taking up the option of providing security and doing a bad job at it.
Yeah. Now, the most astounding thing to me has been you found some literature where there are actually training materials in the basically in the church realm where they're trying to train people who run and are senior officers within churches on what their responsibilities are. And in those training duties, they place a security safety burden on the ushers and the greeters and the people that are basically on the forefront of the church while the rest of the congregation goes in. Is that correct?
That's right, Jim. And you know what's astounding about that is it's just the analysis you gave a moment ago is applicable here. You know, the individual greeter or usher who becomes some sort of security guard or takes on a function as a security person might become personally liable as well as liability for the church and the way that they conduct that. And that becomes part of the analysis that we mentioned a moment ago is if in doing the security, if you decide that you're going to engage your own members in conducting security, you know, if you hire someone or you allow them to work in your service and they're not adequately trained, or they do what would not be considered appropriate in the field that we're talking about, which is the field of security, then you're on the hook for failing to get someone to do a good job.
Well, what I'm more concerned about, even over and above those good points, is the fact that churches can't claim they're not on notice of this responsibility if church training materials that is out there have set the standard for churches and would imply that ushers and greeters are responsible for safety and security of the congregation. And if that's their function, my grandfather, who was an usher for years, at 80 years old, was an inadequate security officer for the church congregation, I can assure you. And in the church where I attend, there are several. I mean, I've served as usher, and my basic responsibility in my mind was to open the door to let them on in and to work the offering plate.
Well, and so you mentioned that I'd seen these things or looked at them, and they were on the internet. So there are a number of different spots on the internet that are now offering or suggesting, number one, that security is the responsibility of the church. That suggestion of itself is troubling. The second part is they've got a whole training section on what is required to set up this security detail, and it's not separated like you discussed earlier. A ministry of the church. One of the things that you may have seen on listeners is, if you were watching television, is that you may have seen this group called the Sheepdogs, which are a nationwide group that provides training, gives some guidance on how to set up this ministry in your church, and encourages first responders and retired police officers to take up the duty. Now, while they may have had that responsibility in past lives in terms of the professional responsibility, it doesn't mean they're adequately prepared to do that in the church realm. And so it's something you really need to take a strong look at. And there's a good reason to do, as you suggested, Jim, and that is hire a separate outside the church organization to handle security.
Right. Agreed. And not only is that literature out there, and now there's an organization that services to the church community with, sheepdogs looking for retired personnel from law enforcement like to help serve and provide this. But there's also an academy on church safety, as I understand it.
Well, there is, Jim, and this bleeds over into overall risk management. So we're talked about the topics associated with an active shooter coming on the premises, and that may lead the church to make decisions regarding whether you're going to provide security or not, whether you're going to have open access to your church, and what other technology you may apply. But there are other risks associated with churches, which we're not really necessarily talking about that, but that could be in regards to hiring persons who have faulty background checks done, or those persons who are prone to criminal activity become employees of the church. Counseling services where, we've seen a whole lot about sexual harassment, certainly in Hollywood. That is also a problem with churches. It frequently becomes an issue where sexual harassment occurs during counseling. The lines get crossed, and professional counseling is not authorized or is not done appropriately according to standards.
Right. I know churches need to take a hard look at what's happening in school systems and in private schools with respect to volunteers. I know, for example, if you wanted to volunteer to be an assistant sports coach or just work with the athletic teams, you had to go through an entire check as well as some side training before they'd let you be around the children. And I'm talking about high school children, but still children. So because the school was going to make sure that they were not going to have someone that was sorted or improperly trained or had a problem in their background around students. Churches are going to have to do the same thing because they're widely run by volunteers. I mean, without the volunteers, there's no way that a church secretary and a pastor can run the entire church. So there has to be a stronger look, and if it's not happening in your church, you need to do so, a stronger look in considering who's volunteering for these situations and what's known about their background. And what are you allowing them to do? And are they really properly trained to undertake that task? I mean, like, for example, so many times you've got a group of young, maybe middle schoolers that want to go to a camp, and you're begging someone to chaperone. And you're just so happy when you get a couple of volunteers that say they'll spend, 5 days driving to somewhere in North Carolina on a bus and spending the days with those kids and coming back. Well, what if there's a problem on that trip? What
like the Ottawa
right
situation.
What investigation was done to make sure that those volunteers, one, are appropriate to work with those middle schoolers, and two, that they know what to do if there's an emergency or a problem to appropriately react. So there has to be some step taken. Otherwise, the church is just exacerbating potential liability.
I believe that's right, Jim. So the number here is 800-8949. Give us a call. We'll talk about any topic. We're talking today about premises liability, and particularly in regards to churches. And so, Jim, one of the questions we sort of had brought up earlier by one of the persons we talked about this topic with, and that is that should, certainly one of the suggestions is when you come across these horrible events where an armed citizen actually thwarts the crime committed by the criminal. In this case, there were apparently two young men that were in Texas that opened fire with their own weapons against this man, Mr. Kelly, and either killed him or drove him from the place, and ultimately resulted in his own death, either by his own hand or by the gunshots. We don't know yet. What is the suggestion? You hear people say all the time, well, the real solution here is just all of the citizenry that go to the church need to be armed, so that the person who would attend the church would actually be the person who would have the firearm, and anyone that tried to commit the crime would face an armed congregation. Now, that creates a whole number of problems.
Oh, it's just a plethora of additional issues. I mean, for example, Kelly, as I understand it, knew his former in-laws attend this church. It hasn't come out yet. I don't know if he maybe attended the church with his then wife and child on previous occasion. I know more about this. So you want to now authorize him to carry in a weapon to that church as a person visiting that congregation, and then allow things to happen while he's inside the church? You can't do that.
Yeah. And the other problem is that, you're involved in your church service. Are you going to say, if you take up security as one of the measures you decided based upon your circumstances at your church, are you going to bar the citizenry who comes into the congregation from having firearms on their own, so that you can control who has firearms on the premises, make them leave them in their car? Or are you going to allow them to bring them into the service because of the fear that they may have? You can see that that particular scenario has a number of different problems. One of them might be, what's the liability for the church for the person in the congregation who opens fire on someone, maybe mistakenly, and kills someone who they believe was going to commit a crime on the congregation?
Right. And that's no different really than what employees run into, where an employee has a license to carry and is offended when they are not allowed to bring their weapon into the place of employment. Well, you've got to set some rules and boundaries on what you're allowed to do. But employees were allowed, after some litigation, then they were allowed to keep their weapons in their cars, but they couldn't bring them into the place of employment.
Well, I think that's sort of the trade-off we have in our country, and the First Amendment makes church separate from what the governmental authorities would authorize. So we have a separation of the church and state, as we like to say in the colloquialism. That being the trade-off, churches are private. Private churches have to make their own decisions about these issues, and consequently, you can't avoid the liability. I don't think that there's a way for us to limit liability for churches, because they are private entities when they're dealing with these issues. So you've got to be responsible. You got to take a look at your own circumstances and certainly address your insurance. That's one of the things that we haven't said, but I think is important.
Absolute best advice. Not only make sure you've got insurance, but confer with your insurance agent. I know most sophisticated insurance agents will tie you into specialized brokers. I know there's Church Mutual and others that will sit down and talk with you about how they have determined nationwide, based upon the risks that they're insuring, to best address these risks, and take their advice and use that, so that you're staying within your coverage because you're doing what they suggest, and two, you're getting guidance that you don't have to pay for, because that is guidance the carrier will provide to the church free of charge, because you lessen the risk that they're underwriting when they take on the policy.
That's a great point, Jim. And once again, we've had a great and lively show. We appreciate all of our listeners. We want to thank you again. Give us a call sometime if you want to talk about any of our hot legal topics that we talk about on Legal Bytes. We're about finished with this particular half-hour section, and I think we've talked about all the issues, or at least very touched on most of them that you'd come across if you were involved in a church leadership, and particularly discussing this latest topic about church security.
And lastly, please pray for the people in Texas. They have undergone such hurt. The child that lost his entire family, So many of those people in that small town are hurting, and please pray for them regardless of your faith. We'll talk to you next week on Legal Bytes.